All right, so the BuzzFeed bombshell putting a legal focus on Trump's kids and the Trump organization they ran. Sources now saying that Trump directed Cohen to lie to Congress about the Moscow Trump Tower project. And it names Trump's kids, Ivanka and Donald Trump Jr., as having a big hand in the planning of that tower, receiving regular and detailed updates about the project from Cohen himself, with Mueller learning about Trump's alleged directive to Cohen through interviews with multiple witnesses from the Trump organization, even internal company emails, text messages, and a cache of other documents. As Ari pointed out, the Trump organization, it's not General Motors, it's not a huge company. It's basically a family-run organization. The executives are his kids, Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump Jr., and Eric Trump. That is the executive board you're seeing right there. And the lawyer was Michael Cohen, who is cooperating now. The CFO was given immunity from prosecutors, and that pretty much paints for you the picture of how this organization was run.
The other 4 people who were inside the Trump organization at the time this felony was committed, who apparently would have had the authority within the company to make something like this happen. They happen to be 4 people who were employed as top executives at the Trump organization, who all have the same last name.
All right, and just moments ago on this program, you saw Senator Richard Blumenthal tell me that Donald Trump Jr. should face criminal charges if, in fact, he lied to Congress. Joining me now once again, Glenn Kirshner, former federal prosecutor, and NBC's Ken Dilanian joins us live from Washington, D.C. Ken, let me begin with you. Let's talk a little bit about the very latest news and how it impacts the Trump family and the Trump organization.
Sure, Eamon. Well, look, it could be hugely significant. I just want to throw a little bit of a caution flag, though, which is that no news organization, including NBC News, has confirmed this story today. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, nobody. And this is a story that is based on the testimony of 2 law enforcement officials, and that would mark the first time that law enforcement officials with access to secret Mueller material have leaked something to the press, potentially in violation of the law. I'm not saying that I disbelieve the story. I'm saying that we should throw that out as a caution. And also the notion that the story asks us to believe that people in the Trump organization are emailing and texting one another about an instruction from Donald Trump to Michael Cohen that he lie to Congress. To some people, that doesn't make a lot of common sense, that they would put that in writing. So those are the caveats. Now, if this story is true, obviously it's a game changer. You've been talking about it the whole hour. It's huge. It's potentially an impeachable offense. And it puts new scrutiny on both Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump, because this story suggests, and Michael Cohen is suggesting, that he briefed them extensively on this secret Trump Tower Moscow deal that was unfolding during the presidential election. And Donald Trump Jr. told a very different story to Congress about this. He said he was only peripherally briefed on this, that he wasn't, significantly involved. And so if that ends up conflicting, if he told a lie to Congress, he's potentially on the hook. But we'll just have to see hugely whether this story is true. The other thing, Eamon, is there's growing pressure if the story is true. I've heard some members of Congress and even a former member of the intelligence community tell me Robert Mueller has an obligation to deliver this evidence immediately, because Congress has been lied to and they have a right to act on it to start impeachment proceedings. Some people are wondering why Mueller would sit on this for months if, in fact, he's got evidence that the president committed a crime.
Yeah, and that could perhaps be part of the motivation behind those who may have leaked that information. You brought up a very important caveat in all of this, which we should note. Glenn, let me get your thoughts on this particular point in all of this. That is Donald Trump Jr. Telling the Senate back in 2017 that he is peripherally aware of the Moscow project. Obviously, the BuzzFeed report, if in fact true, would contradict this. You heard Senator Blumenthal say that means Trump Jr. should be criminally charged. That's a significant development.
I agree, Eamon. And I just heard Senator Blumenthal say the time is right to have Donald Trump Jr. come back before his committee, the Senate committee. And I think that makes perfect sense. And here's why. We now hear Donald Trump Jr. use a term like, well, I was on the periphery. That's one of those slippery, lawyer-esque terms that gives him a lot of wiggle room. Here's what I think makes a lot of sense. Invite him back to testify again or subpoena him and have him say one of 3 things. I stick with my periphery claim. No, I may have made a mistake and I may have known more about it, perhaps learning from Michael Cohen than I let on the first time. Or he could plead the 5th if he thinks he has some criminal exposure for not being straight with the Intel Committee the first time.
Let me get your thoughts very quickly on this point that Bob Mueller perhaps should come forward with this bit of information if, in fact, it's true. Separate from everything else that he is investigating, if he believes that Congress has been lied to, does he have an obligation to come out sooner than this report and at least just present that portion of this finding?
Having worked directly for Bob Mueller and learned in part how to be a federal prosecutor from Bob Mueller, I would not presume to tell Bob Mueller how to do his job. It does seem like there's a certain urgency involved if the Mueller investigation has strong evidence that Michael Cohen lied to Congress, not about something minor, but about something like potential lies by the president, Russian collusion, conspiracy, subornation of perjury. That's something that I think we need to deal with now.
Yeah, it feels like this is a different threshold if, in fact, this report is true. Glenn Kirshner, appreciate your insights. Ken Delanian, always appreciate yours as well. Thanks, bud.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.